Goliath's daughter, the giant slave woman who crushed her master's skull with her bare hands on a suffocating summer night when the air around Charleston felt thick enough to choke the breath from a man's lungs. A discovery was made that would rot quietly in the bones of the city for generations. Inside a grand plantation house, in a library lined with dark shelves and the smell of old paper and polish, Josiah Crane was found dead. His body lay twisted beside his desk, his head no longer shaped like a human skull but shattered into something unrecognizable. Physicians who examined him later would whisper in disbelief, noting that fragments of bone had been driven into solid wood several long strides away, as if death itself had struck with impossible force. The injuries told a story no one wanted to say aloud. This was not an accident. This was not a weapon. This was hands. The coroner's report, still sleeping in county archives, spoke in careful language of pressure beyond ordinary limits, of fingers strong enough to crush what should never yield. And in the shadow of that room, one presence hovered like a stain that could not be scrubbed away. A woman of terrifying stature, taller than any man in the house, built not of softness but of dense, unforgiving muscle, was gone. She vanished into the heavy August darkness as though the earth itself had swallowed her. Her name, whispered later with dread and fascination, was Sarah Drummond. For generations, people argued whether she had ever truly existed. Some said she was nothing more than a ghost story born from guilt, a convenient monster invented to distract from cruelty too shameful to face. Yet records remain, bills of sale, medical notes, testimonies given by trembling witnesses. They all point to the same unsettling truth. Sarah was real, and what happened in that library was not sudden madness. It was the final breath of a horror that had been tightening its grip for years. Before the night of shattered bone and silence, before the echo of terror that rippled through Charleston society, Sarah's story began somewhere far more mundane and far more cruel. It began with money. The spring trading season had turned the port into a roaring machine. Ships arrived endlessly, their holds packed not just with goods but with chained lives. Charleston was no ordinary city. It was a marketplace of flesh, where human beings were priced, inspected, and exchanged with the same indifference reserved for barrels of rice or bales of cotton. The rice plantations surrounding the city were places of slow death. Workers stood for endless hours in stagnant water, their skin eaten by insects, their lungs filled with damp air heavy with sickness. Snakes slid through the mud. Alligators watched from the reeds. Many did not survive their first year. The plantations devoured people, and the owners replaced them without a thought. This hunger created a twisted demand. Traders searched relentlessly for bodies that looked strong enough to endure the swamps. Sometimes they found something extraordinary. When a coffle arrived from the northern countryside, one figure drew immediate attention. She was still very young, barely beyond girlhood, yet she towered over everyone around her. Her shoulders were broad, her arms thick with corded muscle, her hands so large they seemed almost unreal. Witnesses would later recall how she had to lower her head to pass through doorways, how chains looked fragile against her frame. Her name, the only one recorded, was Sarah. No one understood why she was the way she was. To the men who stared at her with open mouths, she was not a person but a marvel, a living anomaly. They did not know about hormones or tumors or medical explanations that would come long after. To them, she was something unnatural, something valuable. The auction house filled with murmurs as she was brought forward, iron biting into her wrists and ankles. Even the seasoned auctioneer hesitated, struck by a rare flicker of awe and unease. The bidding rose fast, driven by greed and spectacle. Men shouted offers, seeing not just labor, but profit in her size alone. She could work harder, endure longer, intimidate others. She could be shown, displayed, whispered about. In the end, the winning voice came from the back. Josiah Crane. He paid a sum so high it turned heads and tightened throats. With that transaction, Sarah Drummond became his property. What followed on Crane's plantation was never fully recorded, but the silence speaks louder than words. Those who worked beside Sarah later hinted at cruelty sharpened by fear. a master who felt smaller every time she stood near, a house that seemed to shrink when she entered. Some said he punished her more harshly than the others, as if trying to grind her down to size. Others claimed he used her strength until her body shook, then demanded more. Whatever the truth, something inside her was being pressed, compressed, the same way bone would later be pressed into wood. On the night Josiah Crane died, the plantation slept uneasily. Sarah screamed. The swamp breathed. Somewhere inside the big house, a door opened. No one heard a gunshot. No blade was found. Only the aftermath remained. A skull destroyed by force no man in that room could have wielded, and Sarah was gone. They searched the swamps, the roads, the docks. Dogs lost her scent as if she had dissolved into the night. Some swore they saw a massive silhouette moving through the reeds. Others claimed she reached the water and walked straight into it, refusing chains even in death. The truth slipped away, leaving only fear. To this day, her name lingers like a bruise on Charleston's memory. Sarah Drummond, a woman turned into a monster by the system that owned her. A giant shaped by suffering, and when the pressure became too great, when years of horror reached their breaking point, something finally cracked. In that library, beneath the weight of silence and history, the past closed its hands and did not let go. Crane was a rice planter cut from the hardest timber of the low country, a man whose land lay far from the city's polite streets, buried deep in tidal swamps where rivers twisted like restless serpents. Marsh Bend was his domain, surrounded by water that rose and fell with the pull of the moon, a place where the earth itself seemed to breathe slowly and with malice. He was no young dreamer clinging to ambition, but a seasoned master hardened by loss and authority, a widower whose grief had curdled into control. Among other planters, his name carried weight and quiet dread. He believed fear was the only language worth speaking, and mercy in his mind was weakness disguised as virtue. When Sarah was led away from the auction block, the leather collar heavy around her neck and marked with Crane's ownership, those watching felt something shift in the air. Her wrists were bound, yet she moved without struggle, without sound. No sobs escaped her lips, no plea rose from her chest. She stared ahead, eyes dark and sealed, as if already looking beyond the world before her. Chains rattled softly against her immense frame, but she carried them with an eerie stillness, her steps measured, her posture almost regal. It was not resignation that radiated from her, but something colder, something waiting. No one there understood what they had witnessed. They did not know they had seen the first page of a story soaked in blood and silence, one that would coil itself around the low country and refuse to loosen its grip. Yet perhaps someone sensed it, as Crane led her toward his wagon, wheels creaking under the promise of distance and suffering. A voice cut through the noise of the market, an old woman, free and weathered, selling flowers near the edge of the crowd, watched them pass and spoke words that tasted like prophecy. "That man has just purchased his own death." The sentence fell into the dust and stayed there, ignored, waiting. Marsh Bend was everything the low country celebrated and everything it concealed. The main house stood proud and pale, columns rising like bones beneath the sun, a wide veranda gazing out over rice fields that stretched endlessly toward dark water. Behind it, the machinery of bondage lay exposed. The kitchen stood apart, thick with smoke and heat. The overseer's cottage crouched nearby, watchful. A barn, a mill, and a line of cramped cabins completed the picture, their walls rough and splintered, their floors bare earth, their interiors sealed from light. Beyond them, the fields spread wide, a careful lattice of dikes and channels designed to command the tides, forcing the land itself to labor. When Sarah arrived, she was placed into one of those cabins, sharing the space with women who stared at her in fear and awe. She had to bow her head to enter, her shoulders nearly brushing both walls. The overseer, a thin man with restless eyes and shaking hands, could not hide his unease. In a letter penned late at night, ink blotched with hesitation, he described her as something that did not belong to the ordinary world. He wrote that when she stood fully upright, she looked less like a woman and more like an ancient monument awakened from stone, and that being near her made his skin prickle with unease. Crane, however, did not see a mystery. He saw opportunity. He had not paid such a fortune to bury her in mud alone. Within days, visitors began arriving, drawn by rumor and curiosity. Sarah was summoned from the fields or the cabins and brought before guests like a rare animal. She was ordered to stand in parlors and on the veranda, her shadow stretching long across polished floors. Crane made her lift what others could not. Barrels swollen with grain. Iron tools meant for teams of men, living animals that squealed as they were raised from the ground. He positioned himself beside her, a deliberate contrast, and invited laughter and astonishment. Men placed their hands inside hers, gasping at the difference, marveling at her grip. Their fascination buzzed like insects, never considering the silence in her eyes. A visiting physician recorded his impressions in a diary meant for educated peers, noting her immense proportions, her strength displayed with disturbing ease. He admitted the sight unsettled him, that it felt as though nature had stretched itself too far, creating something powerful and unsettling. Yet even he did not question the cruelty of the spectacle. He wrote, observed, and left, carrying his unease back to the city while Sarah remained. When the visitors were gone, the real punishment began. The rice fields swallowed her days. She waded into water thick with decay before the sun rose, remaining there until her muscles trembled and her skin burned. The water clung to her legs, alive with leeches and hidden threats. Snakes slid past unnoticed until they struck. Mosquitoes clouded the air, their whining relentless, their bites carrying sickness. The heat pressed down like a hand on the back of her neck, and the humidity stole every breath. Her size made her valuable and dangerous. She could do the work of many, lifting, pounding, hauling without pause. The heavy pestles rose and fell under her control faster and harder than anyone had seen, but because she could endure more, she was given more. Eyes followed her constantly. Any pause, any moment of rest was punished. Her strength drew envy, resentment, and fear, and those emotions found release in cruelty. At night, as the swamp breathed and the cabins filled with exhausted whispers, Sarah lay awake. The world outside hummed and creaked, water shifting, insects calling. Something inside her was tightening, coiling like a fist, slowly closing. Each day added weight, each order, each display, each hour in the fields pressed down harder. The land remembered everything. The house watched. And far from the city, beneath a sky heavy with stars and secrets, Marsh Bend began to feel less like a plantation and more like a waiting grave, holding its breath for the moment when pressure would finally become too much. When Crane wished to remind the fields who truly owned their bodies, he chose Sarah, not because she had slowed, not because she had spoken out, but because her size made the lesson unmistakable. If even she could be broken in public, then no one was safe. The message traveled faster than any whip crack. The punishments were deliberate, ritualized, and cruel enough to linger in memory long after skin healed. Posts waited in the open like silent witnesses. Wooden restraints forced bodies into shapes the human frame was never meant to hold. There were methods designed not merely to hurt, but to humiliate, to bend the spirit into something smaller. Sarah endured them all. Letters written in hurried ink by the overseer recorded these moments with a disturbing calm, noting occasions when Sarah was punished not for wrongdoing, but for refusal to be paraded, for failing to perform like a trained curiosity. Yet she did not shatter as Crane intended. She did not beg. She did not scream. She absorbed pain with a stillness that unsettled those watching. The blows landed, blood followed, but something inside her remained untouched, watching, learning. Among the enslaved community, her presence became a contradiction. She was feared, yes, but also trusted. Her strength was summoned for the most brutal labor, for lifting what others could not, for forcing open gates that controlled the tides, for dragging timber from the mud. Yet when danger rose, she was there. Whispers spread of her stepping between raised whips and children too small for the fields, of her carrying collapsed bodies back through water and heat, of her standing unmoving when families were threatened with separation. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice carried weight, low and unwavering, as though it came from somewhere deep and ancient. They gave her name, that were half reverence, half superstition. Some called her Tall Sarah, others called her the Wall, because once she decided to stand, nothing passed through her without consequence. Crane noticed this change. He felt it in the way eyes followed her instead of him. He felt it in the hesitation of overseers who once barked orders without thought, and for the first time he sensed that fear might be flowing in a direction he could not control. The confrontation that revealed this truth arrived during a suffocating summer. A visitor from Charleston came with an idea wrapped in money and prestige. He wanted Sarah displayed beyond the plantation, turned into the centerpiece of a traveling spectacle where people paid to gape at wonders and aberrations. Crane agreed without pause. The offer promised profit and admiration, and he assumed obedience would follow as it always had. When he informed Sarah, he expected silence. Instead, she met his gaze. Her eyes did not flicker, her voice did not rise. She simply said she would not go. The words landed heavier than any strike. Crane repeated himself louder now, the authority in his tone cracking. Again she refused, calm and absolute. In that moment, something invisible broke between them. He summoned the overseer. He ordered punishment at once. What followed was spoken of in whispers long afterward. Men approached her, confident in numbers. She did not lash out. She did not strike them. She stopped. She rooted herself to the earth as though the swamp itself had claimed her. They shoved, dragged, struck her with hands and wood, but she would not move. The effort left them breathless, humiliated. Only when threats were made against others did she finally step forward, her compliance bought not with pain, but with the promise of greater suffering for those she protected. The lashes fell, flesh split, blood darkened fabric and ran down her back. Not a sound escaped her mouth. Those watching swore her silence was worse than screams. When it ended, she stood on her own, spine straight, eyes forward, and walked away without help. She was not taken to the city. The deal dissolved into excuses and lies. Crane told himself he had won, but the truth gnawed at him. He had backed down, and everyone had seen it. After that day, the plantation shifted. The routine continued, but something underneath had changed. Crane still displayed her to visitors, but he no longer tried to remove her from Marsh Bend. Punishment still occurred, but less often, delivered with hesitation. Authority, once absolute, now felt brittle. Each act of cruelty seemed to weaken it further, as though the plantation itself was rejecting him. Beneath the surface of daily labor, something else was growing. A tension that thickened the air, a sense that the land was remembering every injustice. When Sarah became pregnant, the whispers sharpened into dread. No official record named the father, but the stories told among the cabins were grim and consistent. They spoke of nights when power came uninvited, of a body claimed without consent, of a child conceived in violence. Crane's reaction was not joy or concern, it was possession. He saw the pregnancy as another asset, another extension of his ownership. Orders tightened. Surveillance increased. Sarah was watched constantly, as if the life growing inside her made her even more dangerous. The community closed ranks around her in subtle ways, sharing food, easing her labor when possible, guarding her when they could. As months passed, the heat grew heavier, the nights louder with insects and distant thunder. Sarah's body changed, but her presence did not diminish. If anything, it deepened. Those who passed her felt something they could not name, a gravity that pulled at their thoughts. The swamp listened, the house loomed, and somewhere in the future, unseen but inevitable, a night waited. By the time the cicada screamed through the final summer, Marsh Bend no longer felt like a place that could contain what it had created. The pressure that had been building for years pressed harder with every breath. Pain, humiliation, resistance, and loss had been layered one upon another, forming something dense and volatile. And when that pressure finally sought release, it would not do so gently. It would arrive with hands strong enough to crush, and a silence so deep it would echo long after the screams were gone. His name was Marcus, and he moved through Marsh Bend like a quiet shadow shaped by loss. He was a craftsman by trade, a carpenter whose hands understood wood the way others understood prayer. Gates, mills, beams warped by water and time, all yielded to his patience. He had arrived at the plantation years before Sarah, purchased not for strength but for skill, taken from an estate where his usefulness outweighed his humanity. Long before Sarah ever stepped onto the swamp-soaked ground of Marsh Bend, Marcus had already buried his past in silence. His wife and small daughter had been sold away from him, torn from his sight so completely that even their faces began to blur in memory. After that, something inside him closed, and he became a man who spoke only when needed. When Sarah entered his world, what grew between them was not fire or urgency, but something rarer and more dangerous. Respect. In a place where bodies were owned and futures erased at a whim, they found a fragile sense of balance in one another. In the evenings, when the fields finally released them, and the swamp exhaled its damp breath, they would sit near the cabins, speaking softly. Marcus told her of structures he had built, of distant plantations, of tools and techniques, of a life defined by creation rather than destruction. Sarah listened. She had been moved so often, sold and resolved, that the memory of her own mother had thinned into something ghost-like. Listening became her anchor. When she realized she was carrying a child, the knowledge rippled through the quarters like a tremor beneath the earth. Pregnancy always carried two faces, one of fragile hope, the idea of family continuing despite everything, and one of terror. A child meant exposure. It meant another life Crane could claim, another soul measured in value and profit. On this plantation, under this master, it meant danger sharpened into certainty. From the beginning, her pregnancy was heavy with difficulty. Her immense frame, once a weapon used against her, turned inward, making each change more painful. She remained in the fields as expected, water dragging at her legs, heat pressing into her spine. Those who worked beside her noticed the difference. The pauses, the way her hand sometimes pressed against her lower back, the brief tightening of her jaw that betrayed pain she refused to voice. Crane noticed as well, but his thoughts followed a darker path. He spoke openly of the child as if it were already his possession, speculating about size, about strength, about the price such an offspring might command in years to come. These words traveled quickly, carried by servants, whispered from cabin to cabin, and when they reached Sarah, they planted a fear unlike any she had known. She had endured suffering meant for her body. This threatened something deeper. The thought of her child displayed, punished, sold or broken in the same way made something inside her go cold and sharp. Marcus saw the change. Sarah grew quieter still, her gaze drifting often toward the main house, as though measuring distance, imagining paths. At night, she sat outside the cabin with her hands resting protectively on her belly, unmoving for long stretches of time. Even those who trusted her strength felt unease when they saw her lie, that as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. As her body grew heavier, her work was finally reduced. She was reassigned to lighter tasks, shelling grain, tending the small garden, helping in the kitchen. Yet, even slowed, she remained imposing. When she stood in a doorway, light vanished behind her. Her presence filled rooms the way thunder fills the sky before a storm. The child came into the world on a bitter winter night when the cold crept even into the swamps. Labor seized her just after midnight. 2 elder women came to her aid, hands practiced, faces grave. What followed was long and brutal. Sarah, who had endured whips and restraints without a sound, screamed. The sound tore through the dark, echoing across frozen fields, reaching the main house like an accusation. Crane awoke and came with a lantern, standing outside the cabin, listening. He would later claim curiosity. Others would call it ownership asserting itself even at the threshold of birth. Just before dawn, the child arrived. A boy, large, strong-lunged, alive. When his cry filled the cabin, something unheard of happened. Sarah wept. Tears streaked down her face as she held him close, tracing his tiny fingers, whispering words meant only for him. Marcus was allowed inside soon after. He stood beside her, and in that moment, those present sensed something unspoken pass between them. A decision. A promise? She named the boy Jacob, a name heavy with struggle and endurance. For a brief span of weeks, something like peace settled over Cabin 7. Sarah sang to her son in a low, rolling voice that vibrated through the walls. Marcus carved small toys from scraps of wood, animals and shapes he placed carefully into the cradle he had built with his own hands. Jacob grew quickly, his presence a fragile light in a place built to extinguish such things. But the plantation watched. Crane watched. By the time summer returned, the child was no longer a newborn but something sturdier, larger than expected. Each passing day tightened the sense of inevitability. The swamp hummed. Cicadas screamed. Heat pressed down like a held breath. Sarah felt it. Marcus felt it. The entire plantation felt it. The fragile happiness could not last. Too much had been taken. Too much pain had been stored in silence. And somewhere ahead, just beyond sight, the future waited with terrible patience, ready to collect everything that had been owed. By midsummer, the child had begun to smile. His small hands reached clumsily for light, for movement, for the sound of his mother's voice. Jacob's laughter, soft and breathy, felt almost unreal within the boundaries of Marsh Bend, like something borrowed from another world. Sarah had returned to work, though not to the flooded fields. She was kept closer to the buildings now, given tasks that allowed her to remain upright, visible, contained. Wherever she went, the child went with her. She carried him against her body, bound to her back, resting on her hip, her massive frame forming a living shield. Her eyes never strayed far from him, not even for a moment. Marcus had done what little he could to carve out safety. With scraps of wood salvaged from repairs and forgotten piles, he reshaped their cabin. He fitted a door that closed fully, added a latch that held, cut a narrow window and fashioned shutters to keep the night out. It was still a place of dirt and splinters, still barely shelter, but it was theirs. Inside those walls they dared to imagine permanence, a family. A future measured not in survival but in belonging. Beyond those walls, Josiah Crane's world was collapsing. The rice market had turned unreliable, profits slipping through his fingers year after year. Investments meant to secure his status instead dragged him toward ruin. Creditors circled, letters arrived with sharper language, patience thinning by the day. By the height of summer, the threat became real. Marsh Bend itself stood at risk. Crane needed money, and quickly. The answer came easily to him. He would sell people. He calculated without hesitation. A handful of sales could steady his footing. 5, perhaps 6 lives exchanged for relief. The only question was which bodies would serve him best. On a suffocating afternoon, a trader arrived, a man whose reputation followed him like a stench. He specialized in desperation, in broken planters and scattered families. He and Crane walked the grounds together, discussing flesh and value with the casual tone of men inspecting livestock. When they reached the kitchen garden, the trader stopped. Sarah was working there, Jacob asleep against her back, her movements slow and deliberate. The trader stared openly. He asked questions without shame. Crane answered with pride. The giant woman, the strongest worker, the child only months old. The trader circled her as she continued to work, never looking at him. His attention lingered on the infant. He asked about the child as price. Sarah's hands froze. She did not turn. Her body stiffened as though struck by cold. The trader spoke of buyers elsewhere, of wealthy households seeking infants to mold, to train from the beginning. He named a sum that made Crane's breath catch. Cash. Immediate. No waiting, silence stretched. When Sarah finally turned to face them, her expression was empty, stripped of softness. A sound rose from her throat, low and animal, not language but warning. She did not beg, she did not plead. She stood. Crane hesitated only briefly. He spoke of consideration, of time, but the truth was already known. The need was greater than mercy. The child was already counted. That night, the cabin held whispers sharp with urgency. Sarah and Marcus spoke long after darkness settled, their voices barely rising above breath. No one knows the words exchanged, but whatever passed between them carried weight enough to fracture the future. By morning, Marcus was gone. An enslaved man disappearing into the night was dangerous but not unheard of. Roads were watched, dogs trained for blood-traced trails through swamp and brush. Capture meant pain, meant to linger, yet Marcus ran not only with fear, but with purpose. Hidden within his coat was a map drawn by his own hands, tracing Marsh Bend, the surrounding land, the path toward the city. Alongside it, a letter written in desperation, pleading for intervention, for any soul willing to stop the sale of a child. It was a fragile hope, almost foolish, but it was the only one they had. Crane learned of the escape shortly after dawn. His response shattered the plantation's fragile calm. Orders flew, horses were readied, patrols summoned. Men rode hard through swamp and field, dogs unleashed, voices carrying through heat and water. Chaos reigned as Marsh Bend turned itself inside out in pursuit. Marcus was found before midday, miles away, trying to cross a narrow creek. The mud betrayed him. The dogs caught his scent. When he was dragged back, ropes cut into his flesh. Bites marked his arms and legs, but he lived. His eyes were open, silent. Crane wasted no time. He ordered punishment prepared at once, not privately, publicly. Sarah watched as Marcus was bound. She did not scream. She did not rush forward. Her stillness was terrifying. Those nearby felt it, a pressure in the air, a sense that something immense had just drawn a breath and was holding it. Marcus looked at her once. Whatever passed between them then required no words. The punishment was meant to break him. It was meant to remind everyone watching who held power. But as the blows fell, something shifted. Not outwardly, not yet. Inside Sarah, something ancient and patient settled into place. That night, the plantation slept uneasily. Cicadas screamed. The swamp murmured. The main house stood quiet, unaware that it had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return, because by dawn the choice would be made, and by the following night the debt Marsh Bend had been accumulating for years would come due, not in coin, not in contracts, but in bone, in blood, and in a silence so complete it would haunt the low country long after the river swallowed the last echo of screams. What followed was retold again and again, in sworn rooms and whispered halls, each version bending slightly depending on the mouth that shaped it, yet all agreeing on one truth: the moment violence was chosen, the plantation crossed into something darker than cruelty. Crane wasted no time. He commanded that Marcus be seized at once and bound where all could see. He declared that he would carry out the punishment himself, that it would be unforgettable, a lesson burned into flesh for anyone who dared imagine freedom. The people were forced to gather, pressed close, their silence heavy. Sarah was pulled to the front and made to stand there with Jacob clutched against her chest, the child already restless, sensing the wrongness in the air. Marcus was stripped and tied. The first strike cracked through the heat like thunder, then another, and another. Crane's arm rose and fell with deliberate force, each blow driven not only by anger but by calculation. Skin split, blood followed. The sound changed as the body failed, as pain passed beyond screaming into something quieter, more terrible. Marcus sagged against the ropes, breath shuddering, eyes unfocused. Still the blows came, until his body no longer resisted, until he hung there like something already half gone from the world. Through it all, Sarah did not move. Her face was rigid, almost sculpted, as though grief itself had hardened into stone. Jacob cried, sharp and panicked, his small fists clutching at her dress, but she did not look down. Her gaze never left Marcus. Those who later spoke of it said her eyes did not blink. They said that when Marcus drifted back into awareness, even for a heartbeat, he searched only for her face, as if anchoring himself there kept him from slipping entirely into darkness. When it ended, Marcus was cut loose and dragged away, his body limp, breath shallow, carried back to the cabin by hands that trembled. Crane turned to the gathered crowd, his shirt marked, his face flushed with exertion and something like satisfaction. He warned them all that this fate awaited anyone who aided escape, anyone who knew of such plans and stayed silent. Then he dismissed them, his voice sharp as a blade. All were sent away except Sarah. He stepped close to her, so close she had to angle her head downward to meet his eyes. Beside her immense stillness, He seemed small, but his voice carried no weakness. He told her that the next morning the buyer would return. He told her that she would surrender her child without resistance. He told her that if she cried out, if she disrupted the exchange market, would be punished again, and next time there would be no recovery. He demanded acknowledgement. Sarah offered none. She stared at him, her eyes dark, unreadable, reflecting nothing back. After a long moment that unsettled even him, Crane turned away and walked toward the main house, the decision already sealed. That night, an unnatural quiet settled over the land. The swamp insects dulled their chorus. Even the wind seemed to pause. In the cabin, Sarah sat on the floor, rocking Jacob until sleep finally claimed him, her movements slow and rhythmic, almost ceremonial. In another cabin, Marcus lay face down, his back treated with grease and crushed leaves by careful hands, drifting between agony and darkness. And in the main house, Crane sat alone with his ledgers, sipping brandy, calculate how the money from the sale would ease the pressure closing around him. He told himself it was necessary. Still, his gaze kept drifting toward the distant cabins, unease threading through his certainty. None of them understood that the world they knew was already ending. Morning arrived thick with heat, the air clinging to skin like a damp shroud. The sun rose, stained red through the mist, and later people would remember that color, insisting it meant something, insisting the land itself had tried to speak. Sarah rose before the others. She fed Jacob, washed him, dressed him in the clean garment she had saved for something important. She held him close and whispered for a long time. Words pressed softly into his hair, words meant only for him. Then she placed him gently into the cradle Marcus had made and stood there, watching him breathe before turning away. She worked the garden as if guided by strings, every motion exact, every task completed without hesitation. Those nearby sensed the strangeness of it, the way she seemed distant, unreachable. When they tried to speak, she did not respond. It was as though she had stepped inward, into a place beyond grief where only resolve remained. Near midday, the buyer arrived in a van, his presence immediately souring the air. He went straight to the main house, where papers were drawn up and money changed hands. The child was reduced to ink and ownership, to a transaction concluded with practiced efficiency. When the message came that Sarah was to bring the child, it was delivered carefully, as though fear itself carried the words. Sarah listened. She nodded once. She set aside her tools, wiped her hands, and walked back to the cabin. When she emerged, Jacob was awake in her arms, his eyes bright, unaware of the weight pressing down upon them. She held him securely and began the walk toward the main house, her steps steady, her face calm. Those who watched would later say there was something wrong in that calm, that it felt like the silence before a storm that does not pass by but stops, turns, and devours everything in its path. And somewhere beneath the soil of Marsh Bend, something ancient stirred, as if summoned by a promise made not in words but in blood and in love twisted by despair. She crossed the yard toward the great house, neither rushing nor faltering, as though her feet were no longer bound by fear or hope. Her face held no expression anyone could read. Behind her the others watched, some with hands over their mouths, some openly weeping. A few waited for her to break into a run, to scream, to turn back and fight fate itself. But Sarah did none of those things. She climbed the steps, her shadow stretching long across the boards, and vanished into the house that had already taken so much. What unfolded inside was later pieced together from shaken voices and careful testimony, fragments stitched into a shape that never quite felt whole. The air in the library was heavy, thick with the smell of paper, ink, and authority. Crane stood near his desk. Gadsden waited beside him, uneasy, already regretting how personal the transaction had begun to feel. Sarah paused just inside the doorway. Jacob pressed against her chest, his small warmth the last proof of a life that was slipping away. Crane motioned her forward. She stepped once, then again. Then she stopped. The men waited, expecting obedience to carry her the rest of the distance, but she remained where she was, unmoving. The silence lengthened, stretching until it felt strained, until even the ticking clock on the wall seemed too loud. Crane spoke her name, His tone edged with impatience, and told her to surrender the child. Sarah lifted her gaze, first to Gadsden, then back to Crane. When she spoke, her voice was barely sound at all, a breath shaped into a word. Please. Those who later heard of it struggled to believe it. She had never begged before. Not for rest, not for mercy, not even under the whip. Crane's expression hardened, whatever softness might have stirred crushed flat. The decision was final, he said. The order stood. Sarah did not move. Her arms tightened around Jacob as if instinct itself had seized control. Her voice rose, not loud, but trembling now, threaded with something raw. She promised labor without end, obedience without complaint. She offered everything she had left. Do not take him. Gadsden shifted, discomfort crawling up his spine. Crane rose from his chair, authority flaring sharp and cold. He reminded her of her place. He reminded her that pleading was not permitted. He commanded her to comply immediately. For a moment that felt endless, Sarah stood frozen. Then she looked down at her son. She kissed his forehead, lingering as if memorizing the shape of him. She whispered words meant to stay between skin and soul. When she lifted him, her hands shook. The first visible crack in the immovable woman Marsh Bend thought it knew. She extended him outward. Gadsden stepped forward and took the child. The instant Jacob left her arms, he cried, a thin, piercing sound that cut through the room like glass. Something broke. Sarah's face collapsed inward for the briefest moment, anguish flashing, naked and unbearable, before she forced it back into emptiness. Her arms remained extended, fingers curved as if the weight of him still rested there, as if reality had not yet reached her. Crane spoke again, softer now, eager to close the wound he had opened. He told her the child would be treated well, that there would be other children someday, that life would go on. Sarah lowered her hands slowly. She looked at him with an expression that chilled the room, something beyond rage or grief, something final. Then she turned and left without another word. The wagon departed not long after, wheels creaking, Jacob bundled and crying as it rolled away down the drive. Sarah stood near her cabin and watched until the road swallowed it whole. She did not move even after it was gone, standing there as if rooted to the earth itself, as if her shadow were the only thing keeping her upright. The day dragged on beneath a suffocating sky. Everyone felt it. The weight of something unspeakable settling over Marsh Bend. Yet the work continued. It always did. Bodies returned to the fields. Hands moved through familiar motions, minds elsewhere. Sarah returned as well. But those near her sensed the difference. Each movement carried intention. Each step felt measured, almost ceremonial. She refused food. She spoke to no one. Her silence was louder than any scream. As the sun bled into the horizon, she stopped. She walked to the cabin where Marcus lay, broken but alive. She entered and sat beside him. Others pretended sleep, but listened. Their voices were low, steady, stripped of panic. The sound of farewell lingered in the air, even without words. Marcus reached for her hand. She held his. They sat like that for a long time, saying nothing at all. When she finally rose, his voice followed her, weak but clear. You do what you have to do. Night fell completely. Sarah returned to her cabin. She did not touch the food left for her. She sat on the floor, back against the wall, eyes fixed on the empty cradle. Candlelight carved her face into sharp planes of shadow and resolve. When the flame was gone, she stood and stepped into the dark. She crossed the grounds with quiet purpose, her towering shape unmistakable even without light. An old man called after her, his voice trembling, asking where she was going. She did not answer. She did not slow. Later, it would be noted that the clock in Crane's library stopped. At the exact moment she entered the house through the kitchen door. The main house lay silent, unaware that it had just welcomed something far more dangerous than an enemy, because the storm had not passed by. It had come home. A dull, final impact echoed through the house, the sound of great weight meeting wood, followed by a wet, crushing noise that could only be described as something soft and whole being destroyed all at once. It came from behind her, from the heart of the house itself. Earlier that evening, Crane had sent most of the servants away, claiming fatigue, claiming order. Only two remained. Ruth lingered upstairs, smoothing sheets and straightening pillows, preparing a bed that would never be slept in. Isaac, old and slow-moving, worked alone in the detached kitchen, scrubbing the remnants of supper from iron and stone. Crane kept to his library, the sanctuary of his power, the very room where he had torn a child from a mother's arms hours before. There, beneath lamplight and arrogance, he studied his ledgers and drank his brandy, brushing ink lines that recorded profit, loss, and the neat addition of blood money. No one saw Sarah enter. She moved through the shadows like a decision already made, passing through the kitchen door, crossing polished floors that had never known her bare feet. What followed was later assembled from whispers, from trembling testimony, from the shapes left behind when everything else had fled. But one voice, Ruth's, would carry the truth no matter how much it tried to hide. She heard Crane first. His voice rose in irritation, sharp but controlled, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Then came another sound, low and steady, unmistakable. Sarah. Ruth paused on the stairs, a hand tightening on the railing. She told herself to stay where she was. She told herself this was not her place. But fear has a way of sharpening curiosity. As she descended, Crane's words turned cruel, cutting through the dark. He demanded to know how Sarah dared enter. He threatened pain, threatened correction, promised suffering with the casual certainty of someone who had never been refused. Sarah answered, but her words were swallowed by the space between flaws, though whatever she said ignited something vicious in him. He shouted again, louder now, declaring the child gone, the matter closed, reminding her she possessed nothing, not even herself. There was a sudden scrape, the harsh cry of furniture dragged back in alarm. Then his voice changed, the authority cracked. Fear crept in, thin and high. He warned her to stay where she was. He begged distance into existence. Ruth reached the bottom of the stairs and leaned just enough to see through the narrow opening of the library door. What stood before her would follow her into every dream she ever had. Sarah filled the room. Lamplight stretched her shadow into something monstrous, her head nearly brushing the ceiling beams. Crane was pressed against his desk, pale and sweating, one hand clawing behind him, searching blindly. The light fractured across the walls, making Sarah seem unreal, carved from darkness and resolve. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, terribly calm. She said she wanted her son returned. Crane laughed once, sharp and brittle, clinging to law and ownership like armor. He spoke of rights, of property, of paper and ink that made cruelty legal. Sarah repeated her demand. His hand closed around the pistol hidden in the desk. He raised it with shaking fingers and aimed at her chest, swearing he would kill her where she stood. Sarah looked at the weapon, then stepped forward. His warning broke into a whine. He pulled the trigger. The blast shattered the room. Smoke filled the air. Ruth screamed. When the haze cleared, Sarah was still standing. The bullet had torn into her shoulder, ripping flesh, striking bone, staining her dress dark and spreading. She did not fall. She did not cry out. Her face did not change. Crane stared, his mouth opening and closing around nothing. He tried to ready the pistol again, but his hands betrayed him. Sarah closed the distance between them and took the gun from his grip with effortless ease. She flung it aside. It struck the wall and fell useless to the floor. She asked again where her son was. Crane slid along the desk, trapped, words tumbling over one another as he confessed ignorance. He swore he did not know where the traitor had gone. He swore he could fix it. He swore anything that came to mind. Sarah watched him, blood dripping steadily onto the floor, each drop marking time. When she spoke, her voice was barely sound. She told him what he had taken, her body, her years, her child. She asked him what he had left. He begged, but she was already gone somewhere far deeper than mercy. She reached out and grasped his head, her hands enveloping it completely. The scream he tried to make died instantly. Ruth did not stay to see the end. She turned and fled, bursting from the house into the night, her cries tearing through the yard as she ran for help, for light, for anything that could wake the world. Behind her, the house absorbed the final sounds. Wood creaked. Something heavy struck the floor. And then silence reclaimed everything, because what walked into that house was not a servant, not a slave, not even a woman driven by grief. It was a reckoning, and Marsh Bend would never be the same again. By the time Overseer Grimble burst through the doors of the main house, with 2 armed men at his back, the place had already gone still. Not the quiet of sleep, but the deeper hush that follows something irrevocable. They advanced down the hall with weapons raised, expecting chaos, expecting resistance, expecting a wounded animal cornered and dangerous. What waited for them was far worse. The library greeted them with the stench of iron and oil, and something unmistakably human. Josiah Crane lay sprawled beside his desk, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide and glassy, fixed on a point beyond the ceiling as if he had seen something he could not escape even in death. His skull had been destroyed with such terrible force that the very shape of his head had collapsed inward. Books were soaked, papers clung wetly to the desk, fragments of thought and flesh painted the walls. It was not rage made clumsy, it was precision, it was finality. The men stood frozen, struggling to understand what their eyes insisted upon. No blade had done this. No club. The physician would later confirm what Grimble already sensed in his gut. This death had been delivered by hands. Hands so large, so powerful that they had crushed bone as easily as ripe fruit. Sarah was nowhere to be found. Behind the desk the window stood open, curtains fluttering weakly in the humid night air. Beyond it stretched the dark breathing mass of the swamp. A thin trail of blood led from the ruined body across the floor up onto the sill and vanished into the waiting wilderness. It looked less like an escape and more like an invitation answered. Grimble barked orders to break the paralysis. Riders were sent toward Charleston at once. Torches were lit. Dogs were brought. Guards were posted to protect the house, as though anything could still be taken from it. Yet even as he shouted commands, Grimble knew the truth settling in his bones. They would not find her. The swamps surrounding Marsh Bend were old, vast, and jealous of their secrets. A person who understood them could dissolve into that darkness and never return, and Sarah had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. She had killed a master. She had survived a gunshot. She had nothing left to fear. The search spilled into the night like a wounded thing. Men plunged into mud and water, torches sputtering, dogs baying, voices shouting names that echoed back hollow and unanswered. The blood trail guided them easily at first, across trampled earth and into the rice field, then toward the tangled edge of the swamp where land gave way to rot and water. There the trail ended abruptly. No footprints, no torn cloth, nothing. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. By morning, the men returned exhausted, empty-handed, haunted. Marsh Bend woke beneath a sun that felt wrong, as though it had risen over a place already abandoned by mercy. But the nightmare was only beginning. When the authorities arrived later that day, they found a plantation trembling on the edge of collapse. The enslaved community moved like shadows, silent and watchful. Grimble appeared smaller, shaken. The house itself felt wounded, its walls heavy with what they had witnessed. The physician examined Crane's remains with clinical care, though even his trained hands trembled. His report would later speak of catastrophic damage caused by overwhelming compression, of fractures no ordinary strength could produce. He noted impressions along the ruined skull that suggested fingers of extraordinary breadth and length. He wrote, cautiously, that such force exceeded normal human capacity. That sentence would be whispered about for decades. The investigation turned inward when the hunt for Sarah yielded nothing. One by one, voices were summoned. Ruth spoke, her words shaking loose between sobs. Isaac confirmed what he had heard. Others described Sarah's size, her strength, the years of cruelty she had endured, the child taken from her arms. Each testimony added weight to something the law did not know how to name. The pistol complicated everything. It lay where it had been discarded, harmless now. The spent shot lodged in the wall told its own story. Crane had fired first. Sarah had been wounded. The implication hung heavy and poisonous in the air. Could an enslaved woman defend herself against her owner? The law recoiled from the question, yet it could not fully silence it. Marcus was questioned while still broken and barely upright. Suspicion clung to him like damp cloth, but his story held. He had not moved. Others confirmed it. In the end, there was nothing to hold him with but fear, and that was not evident. As word spread beyond Marsh Bend, reaction rippled through Charleston and the Low Country like a tremor. Planters spoke of outrage, of order threatened, of an example that must never be repeated. But beneath the anger lay something colder: fear. If Sarah Drummond could do this, what else had been waiting silently all along? And in the quiet places, among those who had learned to survive by silence, another feeling took root, a dark, trembling awe, a sense that something ancient had finally stood up and refused to kneel. Sarah was never found. No body surfaced. No trace emerged. The swamp kept its silence, but long after, people would swear that Marsh Bend was never empty again, that sometimes in the thick heat before dawn, the reeds would part for no reason, that footprints larger than any man's would appear at the water's edge and vanish, that cries could be heard drifting across the fields, not of pain, but of something far worse, of a mother calling for her child, and of a promise written not in law or ink, but in blood, a promise the land itself remembered, a promise that still waits. If an enslaved woman could strike down her master and vanish without trace, what did that mean for the delicate scaffolding upon which the entire system of oppression rested? Panic swept through the planter class like wildfire. Emergency councils were convened in Charleston and along the Low Country. Patrols were doubled. New restrictions were imposed, and every enslaved person's movements became suspect. Fear tightened around the hearts of those who profited from slavery, but among free black communities, among those who whispered of freedom in secret corners, the story took on a different shape. Sarah Drummond became something more than flesh and bone. To some, she was a symbol of resistance, a living testament even the most cruelly constrained could not be contained. To others, she was a warning of the inevitable violence that slavery brewed in silence and cruelty, and to a few, she was simply a mother whose soul had been stretched past the edge of endurance. The search for her sprawled outward from Marsh Bend, bleeding into the forests, rivers, and swamps of the Low Country. Slave catchers were employed, rewards offered, messages sent to towns and crossroads far beyond the plantation's borders. Reports trickled in. A towering woman glimpsed near the Santee River, moving like a shadow along the misty banks. A giant figure seen along a northern road, walking with unnatural grace, vanishing behind a curtain of trees. A stranger at a church, asking quietly for food, towering above the congregation. None were confirmed. None yielded answers. It was as if the swamp itself had swallowed her, claiming her for the darkness it had kept for centuries. Then, in September of 1827, a letter arrived at the Charleston magistrate's office, delivered anonymously, posted from a town over 100 miles distant. Its handwriting was rough, jagged but legible. Its message was brief and chilling. I am not dead. I will never return. I am going north to find my son. Any man who tries to stop me will meet the same fate as Josiah Crane. Do not follow me. No signature, no flourish, just determination written in ink as crude as the fear it carried. Magistrate Huger, reviewing it in the dim light of his office, knew instinctively that it was genuine. Every word carried the weight of what he already feared, that this woman, scarred, wounded, unstoppable, had survived. The authorities did not publicize the letter. Panic might spread. Inspiration might flare. Instead, they passed it quietly to the region's slave catchers, traders, and local constables, warning them to watch for a woman asking about a child named Jacob, sold from Marsh Bend just weeks before. Nathaniel Gadsden, the trader who had purchased the child, was questioned. He confirmed that the boy had been sold to a family named Havford in Savannah, Georgia. Just days after leaving the plantation, the infant healthy, wrapped and under guard. The Havfords, once made aware of the story, hired armed men to watch their property, aware that the shadows of Sarah Drummond might still stretch across state lines. Months passed, then years. The search dwindled, the swamp keeping its secrets, and the authorities gradually concluded what the heart already whispered. She had likely perished, wounded, somewhere in the wilderness. No trace, no body, no evidence of life. Officially, the case was closed, though a warrant for her arrest remained in dusty record books, haunting offices like a ghost. Yet the story did not end, because legend is a persistent thing. Whispers carried her name from one plantation to the next. Stories emerged of a giant woman moving silently through the forest, appearing along roads or near settlements where children had been sold. She became something between myth and memory, a force too vast to be pinned down by law or reason. In 1831, a group of escaped enslaved people reaching Pennsylvania reported a mysterious woman guiding them through secret paths taller than any human they had ever seen, moving like a spirit across the wilderness, whispering only, "I am looking for my son." In 1835, a plantation overseer in northern Georgia swore he saw her at the edge of his property, questioning him about recent sales. Her figure impossibly large, her eyes burning with a purpose beyond comprehension. When he attempted to detain her, she lifted him with one hand and cast him aside as though he were weightless, and by the time he scrambled upright, she was gone, swallowed by the forest as if it had grown around her. Years later, in 1842, a Quaker woman operating a safe house along the Underground Railroad recorded in her diary the arrival of a visitor, a woman of colossal presence, bearing scars of old violence, who sought only information about a child taken from Charleston. She did not give a name, did not linger beyond one night, and vanished before dawn. When told she could find no news of her son, she wept. These tales, countless and dispersed across decades, became threads in the fabric of Sarah Drummond's legend. Whether they were true accounts or stories woven by hope and fear they endured, they painted a portrait of a mother unstoppable, a spirit unbound, a force of nature that could not be caged. Each whisper, each sighting, each retelling kept alive a single terrible truth. A mother's grief could transmute into power, into violence, into myth. The historical record, sparse and formal, provides no certainty beyond the events of that sweltering August of 1827. But every tale that followed, every glimpse of a woman moving like a shadow through forests and fields, carried the same echo, a promise made in blood, a vow that no law, no whip, no sail could erase. Sarah Drummond became more than a woman. She became a reckoning. She became a warning. She became a legend etched into the soil, the swamps, and the forests of the South. A story that would endure for generations, whispered in fields and safe houses, in the hush before nightfall and in the sigh of the wind over the rice paddies. And still somewhere in the vast, secreted corners of the world she once moved through, that promise waits. Waiting in silence, waiting in shadow, waiting for the child she never surrendered, for the justice she demanded, for the world that cannot forget her. Because some stories, some ghosts, some mothers, they are never finished. They wait, they watch, and they call for a child, for blood, for vengeance, for love twisted into something eternal. And Sarah Drummond, towering and unbroken, became that waiting thing, moving always through the edges of memory and fear. A promise written not in law, not ink, but in blood. A promise the land remembers. A promise that still waits. Several plantations across South Carolina and Georgia began reporting mysterious thefts, food, clothing, medicine items disappearing in the dead of night. Witnesses described a woman of extraordinary height, a figure moving through the shadows as though the darkness itself obeyed her. Some plantation owners became convinced she was surviving in the swamps and forests, living off what she could take, and perhaps aiding other runaways seeking freedom. Among the accounts that surfaced, one stood out, the diary of Samuel Gillard, a plant whose land brushed against the dense forests of Francis Marion National Forest. In 1838, he wrote with a tremor of disbelief, "My overseer swears he saw the giant who slew Josiah Crane years ago. He claims she watched our fields from the tree line at dusk, motionless, blending with the forest as if she were part of it. When he tried to follow, she turned and vanished. He tracked her for nearly a mile, but the creek swallowed all trace. I do not know whether to believe him or dismiss it as whiskey-fueled imagination. Yet he was genuinely shaken, a man not given to flights of fancy. Stories of Sarah Drummond transformed depending on the teller. Among enslaved people, she became a whispered legend, a symbol of resistance, proof that even most oppressed could strike back. Songs were sung about her, carefully coded, a mixture of hope and fear. In these melodies, she became a spectral protector of runaways, a shadowy force punishing masters who had overstepped, her presence haunting the rice fields and forests. Among white Southerners, particularly the planter class, she became the embodiment of terror, a caution, a tale repeated in hushed tones, a monster to justify stricter control and harsher punishment. Some claimed she had turned feral, a cannibal prowling the swamps. Others whispered she had gone mad, attacking any white person she encountered. Each story, no matter how outlandish, exposed the deep anxieties of a system built on fear, control, and cruelty. To free black communities and abolitionists, Sarah was a heroine. She had struck a blow for freedom and vanished, perhaps traveling north, maybe even to Canada. Some believed she had been reunited with her child, her mission not yet complete. Others held that she became a guide along the Underground Railroad, using her knowledge of the southern wilderness to shepherd hundreds to freedom. These tales, lofty as they were, likely blended hope with reality. The truth was almost certainly more mundane, perhaps more tragic. Yet one fact remained undeniable: Sarah Drummond was never captured, never confirmed dead, and never seen again by anyone who could verify her existence. Examination of historical records, testimonies, and remnants of evidence paints a grim, plausible picture. The gunshot wound inflicted by Josiah Crane was serious, with coroner notes documenting significant blood loss. Dr. Palo, examining her absence of medical care, concluded that without treatment, infection and death were highly probable within days or weeks. Sarah was alone, a fugitive in hostile swamps, hunted relentlessly by armed men and dogs. The most likely conclusion accepted by historians is that she survived only long enough to disappear in the wetlands, following waterways where trackers faltered, but ultimately succumbed to her injury. The swamps, alive with alligators, wild pigs, and the merciless processes of heat and decay, would have consumed her swiftly. Within weeks, there would have been nothing to find, explaining why sightings ceased and the blood trail from Marsh Bend ended abruptly. Yet the story refuses to settle into neat closure. The letter sent from Columbia was real. Someone wrote it, someone who knew secrets of Sarah unknown to authorities. If she perished near Marsh Bend, who sent that warning? Reports from Underground Railroad operatives cannot be dismissed lightly. They were serious, disciplined, and principled, documenting encounters with a woman of immense size, a figure moving silently through the forests seeking a child, disappearing before her presence could be fully recorded. And then there is the tale that arrives decades later, haunting the margins of history. In 1889, 62 years after Josiah Crane's death, a physician in Philadelphia, Dr. Robert Hayes, cared for an elderly black woman on her deathbed. As her strength waned, she recounted her story in fragments, her voice frail but unyielding. She spoke of a mother's obsession, a journey through darkness, and a promise that transcended mortality itself. Her words, though nearly lost, hinted that Sarah's story did not end in swamps or blood, but continued, moving silently through the corridors of memory, through whispers in safe houses, across river and forests, carried in the eyes of those who dared to remember. The legend persisted. Reports of encounters trickled in sporadically across decades, across states. A giant woman seen moving silently through the night, asking for a child lost to sale and injustice, a protector, a shadow, a myth given life by grief and fury. Some claimed she aided the helpless, guiding escapees along secret paths. Others whispered that she had become the very embodiment of vengeance, a specter exacting justice on the living as she had on the dead. Sarah Drummond's story cannot be pinned down to fact or fiction. It exists in the liminal spaces between every swath of dark forest. Every hidden waterway, every abandoned cabin, carries the echo of her presence. She became more than a woman. She became a reckoning. She became a memory stitched into the land itself. She became a promise written not in law or ledger, but in blood, a vow carried forward by the wind and the whispers of those who would never forget. In the end, her legend is what remains, a mother searching endlessly for her child. A force of nature, moving through shadow and time. A figure of horror and hope, terrifying and inspiring, haunting the boundaries between history and myth. And though we may never know the truth of her fate, the land remembers, the forests remember, the swamps remember. Every rustle of reeds, every cry of an unseen creature carries the echo of her promise. A promise that waits, a promise that watches, a promise that will never be silenced. Because some stories, some mothers are eternal, some grief is unstoppable. And Sarah Drummond, towering and unbroken, became that waiting force, moving always through memory and fear, a shadow of justice, and love twisted into something beyond the reach of men. A promise written not in ink, not in law, but in blood. A promise that the land itself remembers. A promise that still waits. Listen closely, for this is where the story slips from history into legend, where the shadows of Marsh Bend stretch far beyond the swamps of South Carolina, reaching decades into the north. It was said that a woman dying in Philadelphia in 1889 whispered to her physician that her mother had been a runaway and extraordinary woman of immense size who had slain her owner in the 1820s. She spoke of survival through forests, swamps, and hostile lands, of aid from free black communities, Quaker abolitionists, of endless searching for a child named Jacob that spanned more than a decade. Eventually, she claimed her mother had settled quietly in Pennsylvania under a new name, living out her days until 1867. The physician, Dr. Robert Hayes, recorded the story in a letter, noting it was impossible to verify. 2 days later, the woman died, taking her secrets with her, leaving nothing but question. Could this woman have been Sarah Drummond's daughter? Could Sarah herself have truly survived, escaped, and lived into old age in the North? We may never know. The trail ends in mystery, obscured by time, yet it beckons us to imagine the impossible. What is certain, what is carved in blood and testimony, is the night of August 14th, 1827. The library at Marsh Bend, the air thick with heat and dread, the shadows of the candlelight trembling. Across walls lined with books witnessed a breaking point no human being should endure. Sarah Drummond, a woman treated as property, forced to labor to exhaustion, beaten, humiliated, exhibited as a curiosity, had finally reached the edge of her endurance. That night, when her child was torn from her arms, sold for $400, the last tether of her world snapped. It was not despair that moved her, perhaps, but something colder, harder, a crystallization of rage and purpose. Josiah Crane's skull, crushed by her bare hands, remains the grimest proof of what happened. The authorities found him lying on the floor, his eyes open, staring at nothing. The physical evidence spoke with horrific clarity. A force beyond human capacity, delivered by hands impossibly strong, had ended his life. Sarah vanished that night, climbing through a library window, disappearing into the darkness and the vast, treacherous swamps. Her blood trail faded into silence, leaving only the memory of what had transpired. From that night onward, her story became impossible to ignore. The boundaries between fear and legend blurred, and the question remained, what became of her? The legends took shape differently across communities. Among enslaved people, she became a symbol, a whispered reminder that oppression could be challenged, that a single person could strike back and live on in memory. Songs carried her name in coded rhythms, stories of a towering protector, roaming the forests, punishing cruelty, aiding the helpless. Among white Southerners, she was a cautionary tale, a monster conjured to enforce compliance, a specter haunting their imaginations. Some said she had turned feral, that she prowled the swamps, that she would kill without hesitation. Abolitionists and free black communities spoke of her as a heroine, a spirit moving northward, perhaps reunited with her son, perhaps guiding the lost toward freedom along the Underground Railroad. The rational reconstruction, however, tells a more probable, more tragic story. The gunshot wound Sarah received from Crane was serious. Without care, without medicine, without rest, the swamps would claim her within days. Dogs, men, and the hostile wilderness chased her relentlessly. The logical conclusion, she survived just long enough to vanish, following waterways, evading pursuit. until her injury and the natural brutality of the land consumed her. No body, no proof, only the echoes of her presence. Yet anomalies persist. A letter from Colombia, written by someone who knew private details of Sarah's life, defies simple explanation. Reports from Underground Railroad operatives describe a woman matching her description, moving silently through forests, seeking a child, disappearing like a wraith. In Philadelphia, decades later, an elderly woman's deathbed confession hints at secrets that might bridge myth and history. The documented truth is irrefutable. Sarah Drummond killed Josiah Crane on that August night. She vanished. She was never captured, never confirmed dead. Her existence is verified by sale records, testimonies, coroner reports, and the blood-stained evidence of Crane's crushed skull. She was real. Her actions were real. Her disappearance, whether into death or freedom, became part of the landscape itself. Swamps, forests, and memory carry her story forward. Somewhere, whether in the wilds of South Carolina, the forests of Georgia, or a quiet Pennsylvania grave, her bones rest, her spirit unbound. Jacob, her son, survived. Records trace him to the Harford family in Savannah, where he lived as a house servant. He worked into adulthood, married, had children, and passed away in 1891. In interviews decades later, his descendants revealed that he carried fragments of the past with him, a wooden horse carved by his father Marcus, and a love for his mother that endured even in silence. He named his first daughter Sarah, preserving her memory in flesh and name. The story of Sarah Drummond teaches something elemental about the human spirit. In the darkest hours of history, in the shadow of unimaginable cruelty, individuals resisted. They struck back. They became legends. They endured. Whether Sarah survived beyond the swamps or perished there, her presence towering, unbroken, unrelenting remains. She embodies resistance, maternal love, and the breaking point where suffering transforms into defiance. The details of her fate may forever elude us, yet her story endures because we wish it to. We want to believe that she lived, that she found freedom, that she survived to protect, to wonder, to remember. And so, even when history can only tell us that Sarah Drummond existed, killed Josiah Crane and vanished into obscurity, the truth lives on in the memory of a mother's love twisted into something eternal. She became more than one woman. She became a force, a shadow, a promise written not in ink or law, but in blood. A promise the land itself remembers. A promise that still waits, moving through memory, through fear, through legend, forever at the edges of our sight, forever at the edge of our understanding. Sarah Drummond, towering and unbroken, vanished into the dark, leaving behind only the echo of a mother's cry, a legacy of resistance, and a question that will never be answered fully. Did she survive? Did she find her son, or does she still move, unseen, through the forests and swamps, waiting, remembering, keeping her promise in silence? The land remembers, the shadows remember, and so we remember too.